Hello, everybody. I hope that you can hear us and see us well. We are starting our webinar, and of course, we can wait another minute for everybody to join comfortably for this discussion. My name is Asya Metodieva. I am a researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague and also contribute to the work of the German Marshall Fund. This discussion is under the Central European Program, Engaging Central Europe, and we are going to focus on Bulgaria. But before we start and I introduce our speakers today, it's important to note that our discussion is happening on a day which marks the first meeting between the US President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. They met for the first time in 6 years. This raised hopes for de-escalation of tensions between China and the US. There was no trade deal that was achieved during this meeting, but certainly when we talk about Central Europe, there is a big resonance of every decision that big powers make these days, especially in this year. The focus, as I said, is Central and Eastern Europe, and more specifically Bulgaria, as a potential entry point and opportunity for China to gain more influence in the region. A few months ago, together with my colleague Dimitar Keranov, we wrote a paper that was published, China's Quest Strategy in Bulgaria, Economic Appeal and Political Constraints. This is the paper that we will discuss today, but of course we would like to also extend the discussion and see what are the trends, the differences and similarities when it comes to Chinese influence in countries of Central and Eastern Europe. This is a good moment to also introduce both our speakers. As I mentioned already, Dimitar is the co-author of the paper. He's also a program coordinator with the German Marshall Fund's Engaging Central Europe program based in Berlin, and his areas of expertise include democratization and also Bulgarian politics. Prior to joining the GMF, he worked at the Institute for European Politics in Berlin and in the private sector. And my pleasure is to also introduce Mareike Ohlberg. She's a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program and leads the Stockholm China Forum, also based in the GMF office in Berlin. Her expertise is on China, and she's a co-author of the book Hidden Hand: How the Communist Party of China is Reshaping the World, published a few years ago. She also has a doctoral degree with a focus on China studies from Heidelberg University. So a solid background that will help us to actually unpack Chinese influence, not only in Bulgaria, but also to give us more regional perspective. On this note, I think I will give the floor to Dimitar to present the key findings of the paper. Of course, I'm happy to contribute with some additional comments since we worked together on this. But the floor is yours, and thank you for both of you joining us today.
Thank you, Asya, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So our paper is titled China's Quest Strategy in Bulgaria, Economic Appeal and Political Constraints, and it analyzes how China's presence in Bulgaria is expanding not through large geopolitical moves, but rather through subtle long-term positioning, often overlooked in public debates. So uh, why focus on Bulgaria, right? Well, because what happens at the periphery often tells us how strategies adapt within the core of the EU. So, really, the starting point of our research is that Bulgaria represents a strategic opportunity for China, not because it's a high priority target in itself, but because it offers China access into the European Union's economic and regulatory space. So What distinguishes the Bulgarian case is not the scale of engagement, which is relatively limited compared to, for example, Hungary or Serbia, but the nature of engagement. As I said, it's quite incremental and oriented toward shaping future options. Uh, so China's strategy in Bulgaria operates through economic incentives, educational and cultural ties, and local level political relationships. And these efforts are really building blocks of influence, and they do not aim to replace Bulgaria's Western orientation, right? But to create channels through which China can secure strategic advantages over time. So, before we actually look at the economics and politics, uh, a reality check. So, how do Bulgarians actually see China? And public attitudes matter because they determine what becomes politically feasible. And the Bulgarian public increasingly sees China in a positive light. In 2016, 31% of Bulgarians viewed China favorably, and by 2022, this figure had risen to 50%. So that's higher than approval ratings for the European Union, the United States, or Russia in that same survey. And in 2024, nearly 70% of respondents said that they do not perceive China uh, as a threat. So, public opinion reflects growing admiration for China's economic development, but it does not reflect a desire to turn away from the European Union. And this is really a key point. Bulgarians largely view China as economic opportunity and not a geopolitical alternative. So, this domestic perception creates an environment in which Chinese initiatives can advance with relatively little scrutiny. And now let's also take a look at the visible layer, right, which is trade and investment. And here the headline is modest volumes, but targeted placement. And economically, China's presence is real, but it's modest in absolute terms. And yes, trade between Bulgaria and China has nearly doubled since the early 2010s. And actually, China is now Bulgaria's seventh largest trading partner. Uh, Chinese investment has also grown, uh, and it's now roughly 155 million in was 155 million in 2023. However, this Chinese investment still represents less than 1% of Bulgaria's overall inward foreign direct investment. And here, the significance is, as I said, not in the volume, but in the sectors where China is active because Chinese companies have invested in agriculture, automotive components, renewable energy, and real estate. And Huawei, for instance, is the largest single Chinese investor in Bulgaria, operating, as you know, in telecommunications and smart city technologies. And actually, a few concrete examples really illustrate this pattern, but also its limits, because in agriculture, Chinese companies lease large tracts of land, for example, up to 20,000 acres, for the cultivation of crops intended for export to China. And in renewable energy, an estimated 15% of Bulgaria's photovoltaic infrastructure is financed by Chinese investors. And uh, we also see a concrete local entry. And for example, Chinese firms have successfully won EU-funded municipal tenders. So, for example, Yutong electric buses in Sofia and a Veliko Turnovo contract led by Jiangsu Alpha Bus. And these are not large projects in scale, but they're strategically placed in public infrastructure. And it's not noteworthy to mention that, however, many high-profile investment uh, projects have not materialized or have resulted in limited economic benefit. Several proposed infrastructure projects, such as concessions for ports or even airports, and even plans to participate in Bulgaria's nuclear infrastructure have stalled or failed. Uh, and we also need to be aware that expansion is also constrained by competition from entrenched actors. For example, Turkey in construction, the United States in strategic sectors, and actually strategic, uh, this limits rapid Chinese scale up. And I think it's also important to look at the political layer, and that's what me and Asya did, because economics doesn't move alone. It always needs political access. And politically, China's approach in Bulgaria is built on maintaining relationships across the political spectrum and particularly at the local level. And okay, Bulgaria does not have political parties that are explicitly pro China in programmatic terms, but China maintains working relationships with a range of political actors, including those on the margins of power. And the Bulgarian political system is characterized by fragmentation, clientelism, uh, corruption, and these conditions create openings for Chinese engagement at the municipality level, where cooperation agreements are easier to conclude and where long term relationships can be established. And at present, 19 municipalities in Bulgaria have cooperation agreements with Chinese counterparts. Mayors in cities such as the city of Ruse have actively sought Chinese partnerships in cultural exchange, technology infrastructure, and smart city development. And so, really, this local level engagement is a central feature of China's quiet strategy. And if we look at the national level, uh, multiple Bulgarian governments have expressed interest in deepening economic cooperation with China. And Bulgarian governments have largely avoided publicly critical language on China's human rights record, which signals openness even in the absence of a coherent national strategy. And actually, Bulgaria joined the Belt and Road Initiative in 2015 and has been a participant in the 14 plus 1 cooperation platform that's between China and Central and Eastern European countries. So Bulgaria isn't just a passive 14 plus 1 participant. It actually runs the Agricultural Cooperation Association and hosted the 2018 exchange between the 2018 general meeting in Sofia. So also there have been high-level visits in both directions, including exchanges between Bulgarian presidents and prime ministers and Chinese leaders. So politically, top-level signals have been facilitative, and President Rumen Radev, uh, 2019 Strategic Partnership Declaration, and his 2024 calls for a Chinese bank branch and even direct flights show that the door is open, even as policy remains rather fragmented. Uh, and despite these political expressions of interest, Bulgaria has still not developed a consistent national strategy towards China. Uh, so, in the discussion of China's influence, of course, we need to also take a look at soft power, because influence grows through soft power, and education and exchange build familiarity that later uh, lower resistance. And culturally and academically, China has a very well established presence in Bulgaria. Uh, with its Confucius Institutes play a central role. So the first institute in Bulgaria was opened in 26 at Sofia University, followed by another in Veliko Tarnovo. And these institutes, along with classrooms and secondary school programs, have established around 60 teaching sites in 18 Bulgarian cities and are involved in language instruction, cultural promotion, and academic exchange. And actually, more than 140 agreements exist between Bulgarian and Chinese universities. And Chinese scholarships, exchange programs are common. And Yeah, China has cultivated links with students and academic elites. So this network contributes to building familiarity and trust, uh, even if it does not produce direct political alignment. And also, this extends to the media sphere, where China has built partnerships that allow it to shape its image in Bulgaria. So, China Radio International broadcasts in Bulgarian. CGTN is also available. And the Bulgarian news agency has a formal partnership with Sinhua, and Bulgarian newspapers actually publish regular content about China. And in 2023, a House of Chinese Bulgarian journalists and a Bulgarian Chinese media center were established, which further institutionalizes content partnerships. Uh, so there's even one major daily newspaper that maintains a dedicated section on China. And here, these media channels, they present China positively, emphasizing economic cooperation, cultural exchange, development projects. And although this content is not overt propaganda, it contributes to a gradual normalization of China's presence, and it reinforces narratives that align with China's strategic interests and, in some cases, we have found with Russian messaging. And all of this, of course, this leads to the question of risks. And our paper identifies several. So, Chinese investments in critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and digital networks can create dependencies that are difficult to reverse. And Bulgaria's telecommunications infrastructure is a particular area of concern because approximately 65% of its 5G network relies on Chinese providers, especially Huawei. And okay, Bulgaria has formally joined the US Clean Network Initiative, but it has taken few steps to implement its commitments. And dependence on Chinese technology and critical infrastructure carries cybersecurity risks and obviously may undermine alignment with EU and NATO partners. And a structural vulnerability persists because Bulgaria remains one of the few EU member states without a formal FDI, foreign direct investment screening mechanism, making it harder to preempt risks in sensitive sectors, right? And beyond telecoms, for example, cooperation includes 2018 Defense Ministry Memorandum of Understanding on military education and training, routine Interior Ministry contacts, and Chinese surveillance equipment and private security networks that interface with public systems. So those are areas that require strict NATO-aligned oversight. And even as Bulgaria's defense intelligence acknowledges China's ambitions, state level awareness and coordination remain underdeveloped, which leaves gaps between recognition and response. And here, another category of risk that we have identified involves governance because Chinese companies often seek preferential treatment or regulatory exemptions, and deals are not always transparent. And in 2018, for example, the China Development Bank transferred 300 million euro to the Bulgarian Development Bank as a part of a 1.5 billion euro framework lending agreement. So the beneficiaries of these loans were not publicly disclosed, and exactly the lack of transparency in such arrangements increases vulnerability to corruption, political influence, uh, and of course, erosion of public accountability. And soft power also presents a distinct set of challenges because cultural and media initiatives are often presented as neutral, right, or mutually beneficial, even, but they can also serve to shape public opinion. They can serve to marginalize critical voices, create an elite ecosystem that actually favors engagement with China. And also, the overlap between pro China and pro Russia narratives in Bulgaria is a particular concern we have found because both promote skepticism toward Western institutions, question EU unity, and present external engagement from authoritarian states as a legitimate and desirable. And as I mentioned, despite these risks, Bulgaria has not developed a coordinated response, and awareness of China's influence remains low among policymakers and the broader public. And engagement is actually largely reactive and fragmented. And without a strategic approach, Bulgaria risks becoming a passive venue for China's ambitions rather than an active shaper of its own economic and geopolitical future. And actually, this brings me to our recommendations. And these are actually proposals to improve governance, transparency, and resilience. And Bulgaria should adopt a structured and EU aligned policy toward China that sets clear parameters for engagement. It should implement a robust screening mechanism for foreign direct investment, so particularly in sectors such as telecommunications, energy, ports. It should prioritize EU funding and partnerships with democratic allies to reduce over-reliance on any single external actor. And specifically, it should collaborate with the United States on energy diversification, including nuclear, LNG, and renewable energy. And also, Bulgaria should favor EU and US technology providers over Chinese firms and critical infrastructure. And it should invest in media literacy and independent research to improve public understanding of China's strategic intentions. And screening and cyber standards also should be implemented in close coordination with the EU and NATO, using EU and US technical assistance for due diligence and cybersecurity. And last but not least, Sofia, we think, should actively attract EU and US investors in strategic sectors and support investigative media uh, to ensure that deals are uh, made in transparency and accountability. And so, if I can conclude here, I can say that China's strategy in Bulgaria is not defined by large-scale investments or some dramatical geopolitical moves. It is defined by slow, consistent engagement across economic, cultural, and political spheres, and it's actually enabled by domestic vulnerabilities, and uh, this gives China future options, and it also actually allows it to avoid direct confrontation. So the question really for Bulgaria is not whether it should engage with China, right? But how it can do so in a way that protects its national interests, upholds democratic governance, and maintains alignment with its EU and NATO partners, which is very important. Um, so this was the presentation of me and Asya's paper and of our key findings. And thank you very much for your attention. And I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dimitar, for the excellent summary. I couldn't have done it better. And I'm sharing now the link to the full report, the paper on in the chat, so our audience member can read the article if they would like to. I would say that in addition to all the empirical data that Dimitar shared, there is much more linked to the particular areas of influence that we identified. So now I would like to give the floor to Mareike with a few comments on the paper, but also just maybe to open the discussion already with how does China's strategy in Bulgaria differs from other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and what are the, let's say, the key points that we can identify in terms of differences and commonalities.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations to both of you for this paper. I think it's long overdue since there has been very little work done on China and Bulgaria specifically. So I think this is really helpful to better understand China's patterns in the country. A couple of points. I read the report and I actually saw quite a few points that are fairly common for how China engages in Europe. This is not, there are a lot of common trends in there that I think are important to just sum up and to explain what the political logic behind some of this is and what the general principles of engagement are. Now, sometimes you have a country where China, or rather, I should probably name the main actor, that's the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party and the only ruling party of China. Sometimes they have a situation, including in Europe, where they simply have a government in a European country or in an Asian country or in an African country that is fully on board. And in Europe, I mean, examples are Hungary, I guess Slovakia, often flirting with, and then, I mean, outside of the EU, but still in Europe, you have Serbia and a number of other countries that are like that. And the CCP has full buy-in from the national government, and that, of course, is ideal. And if you have that, you can cut a lot of the surrounding stuff that you do as a party. However, one of standard modus operandi of the CCP in Europe, because it is dealing with countries where there is, you know, democratic governments, a more messy landscape, no one clear party that is always going to be in power for decades. What it is doing in those circumstances is it does the broadest possible networking that it can. And this is a pattern that we also see in Bulgaria. You mentioned that, you know, China reaches out to all kinds of parties inside the political spectrum. The CCP itself has a specific department, the International Department, or the International Liaison Department, that is set up specifically to engage in party-to-party diplomacy with other parties. And this is something that you can see here. And there's two types of parties really that are relevant. The ones that might become relevant in the Bulgarian political landscape. But as you mentioned, they sometimes also go towards the political fringe, and that is, they probably see some potential for those parties for the future. They don't want to omit them. But also sometimes those parties are contacted simply because it's easier for the CCP to get supportive statements from them. What they often want is like a chorus of voices in a specific country that will praise China, its policies, the CCP and its great political model, etc. And oftentimes they're more likely to get that from a fringe political party, right? So that's why those are also integrated into this broad networking framework. The broad networking framework continues to the local level, that you have local partnerships all over the place. This is the added advantage that if ever you're in a situation where the national government of a country opposes something that China wants to do in that country, it can then mobilize people at the local level, business representatives, universities, civil society representatives, to try to put pressure on the national or central government to try to convince it that wouldn't it be advantageous to join this Chinese initiative, et cetera, or wouldn't it be better in your national interests if Chinese companies got to do X, Y, Z in your country. So sometimes this kind of broad-based engagement, or quite often it's actually also used to exert pressure on an actor that needs to be overcome. The same dynamic is repeated at the EU level, where of course China tries to pick off or tries to win over as many different EU countries if it faces opposition in Brussels. So for instance, with EV tariffs at the European level, China has explicitly engaged in charm offensives in various countries to try to convince them that having more Chinese electric vehicles in Europe is a good thing, and don't you want to, go against this bad thing that Brussels is doing, limiting or putting tariffs on them. So it's a very common pattern of using a broad base to encircle somebody that needs to be overcome, that's standing in the way of what China wants to achieve in a particular country. There's also one thing that I think I saw in the report. There's some overlap between the pro-Russia and the pro-China voices. We've also noticed in some other countries that China has started to use the Russian networks a little more intensively, simply because compared to Russia, China's general understanding of the political landscape in individual European countries is not great. a lot of this is done guessing. A lot of this is not fully understanding the details, the nitty-gritty of the political dynamics. Like, you have a general idea about how, what some points of leverage might be in a country, but you don't really understand the full dynamics. And Russia just already has some networks that can be disruptive, that are useful for China to piggyback onto. In terms of investments, I also see a lot of similar patterns to other Central and Eastern European countries, in the sense that expectations were often higher than what was delivered in the end, right? So there were lots of hopes for lots of Chinese investments, reinvigorating the economy, being able to actually have a net positive effect. That was disappointed in many, many countries in Europe. But as long as China can keep the hopes alive that maybe something is forthcoming, it is still effective as a tool to kind of dangle investments as a carrot, to say, well, if relations keep improving, especially compared to other countries, maybe we will give more to you than to your neighbors. So this is another way, an incentive that is being used strategically. Other than that, there are some strategic investments and some to make a point and to create long-term dependencies. As in the case of Huawei, you have the company in the network, and you've already laid a path, and it's very difficult to change that in the future because it's costly to rip and replace. So that is one thing where China could get Huawei into the network. It did, and that's gonna become it's not only a problem in Bulgaria, it's a problem in many European countries, including in Germany, where we're based. But that's basically just creating dependencies along the lines. On the soft power front, or Confucius Institute's media engagements, the main problem that I see in Bulgaria and in some other European countries specifically is that basically a large part of the China knowledge and the China expertise that we in Europe desperately need is in this case then provided by China. And I think if this were Russia, everybody could see the problem. If our knowledge about Russia would be provided by a Russian cultural institution or a Russian government affiliated institution, everybody would immediately understand what the problem is. But because it's China, and our knowledge of China is low and is currently only being fed by knowledge provided by China, there is no such reaction as you would have in the Russian case. And that really is the problem. If your only source of knowledge about China comes from China, there's no way that this can improve. And that, to me, is the real problem here, not that there is some kind of institute at a university that teaches Chinese classes or provides the occasional talk. That's fine. But if that becomes your only source of knowledge about China, that's a huge problem. And that we already suffer from the problem in Europe that because our understanding of China is low, we tend to dismiss China as a strategic geopolitical player. It was really, for the longest time, I heard from people all over Europe that, oh, China has no strategy, China only wants to do win-win business, etc., etc. And that is plain wrong. There are absolutely strategic calculations to ensure that Chinese interests get to play out on European soil as well, but that was not seen by many, many different actors in Europe for the longest time because China was simply underestimated. And in order to change this perception, we really need to up our China knowledge, but we need to do it, of course, from sources that are not China. Last point that I want to make, because, I mean, maybe to add to that point, because there's no discussion of China, and because there are all the way that China acts in most European countries is at a very low threshold. You don't have, like you said, Dimitar, you don't have those high-level political interventions. You have lots of small little things. And if you look at each of them separately, anybody can always say, well, what's the big deal? And in principle, I would agree. The problem is, of course, that lots of small things done here and there do add up to a whole lot of weight in the end, right? But nothing is ever, most things are not high enough in terms of, to trigger a kind of threshold response where you're like, oh, this is a really huge risk. This is a massive risk. This is a huge kind of political intervention in our system. it's all below that threshold by and large, with a few exceptions where I would say if you are in critical infrastructure, then maybe that triggers a different level of security risk. But because of the small and scattered approach, we have really struggled to come up with a good response. Any kind of response that we do mount to this, it needs to be done collectively at the EU level, ideally at the EU level with allies and partners. Now, that is currently, I think, a huge challenge because we've seen some shifts in how the US positions itself vis-a-vis China, which has been incredibly unhelpful for coming up with useful allied responses. But at least at the very least, this needs to be coordinated at the EU level, because the whole idea that China is pursuing is, of course, to divide and conquer, to deal with each country on its own, to exploit lack of knowledge about China, to exploit, the fact that compared to China, if China deals with a country individually, it's always going to be the smaller country, right? Whereas as a bloc, as the EU, we have quite significant power. So I do think in whatever we do, the coordinated response, ensuring that at least at the EU level we stay coordinated, is the most important and unfortunately also a very difficult step to take. But without that, there's no way that we're going to be able to deal with it. We can also, again, see where we can still coordinate with the United States, but we're not. With other allies and partners, we should definitely make sure that we coordinate policies with them and see what options there are for similar actions, for similar safeguards, so that we can still, we can still have engagement with China, but it is understanding the conditions, understanding China's strategic interests, and putting certain safeguards in place to avoid completely just selling out your security, as Dimitar already helpfully pointed out. So that really is my takeaway from this paper. It's a really good case study and a really good example of how China operates in Europe. There are some other countries, for instance, in Germany, there's like much higher investment. But the basic idea of working with many different actors in many different local places, business organizations, etc., is quite similar. So it really, in many, many ways, is a classic case for how China engages in Europe, which I think is good for Bulgaria also, because that means you have a lot of other countries that are facing a similar pattern and that you can coordinate with, and that you can try to come up with better strategies for how to deal with that. So that perhaps is one silver lining, so that I end on a positive note. That's it from me. Really looking forward to questions, discussion, and talking things through. Thanks so much.
Thank you for these comments. A lot of questions in my notes, but I would like to also encourage the members of our audience. Please feel free to write questions in the chat. I see that there are already some, so please, we're going to have the time to answer those and engage with them. I think both of you pointed to this gap between recognition and response, and I agree with Mareike that thinking about the possibility of having a united strategy is a way to go. However, in this case, we talk about a country which is not there yet, thinking strategically about a major geopolitical power. And here I would like to maybe ask Dimitar, you hinted at the factors, the internal factors, why Bulgaria lacks this strategy domestically, but maybe to dig a little bit more into the political instability and how this affects the institutional weakness as well. How does this affect the relationship with China in terms of Bulgaria being how to say, having an agency in defining what its interests are in relation to China?
Thank you, Asya. So I think part of the problem why Bulgaria has largely failed to come up with a consistent national strategy, if you want to call it, when it comes to China, is because in recent years, as many of you probably know by now, Bulgaria has been actually a record holder of elections, and this political instability kind of, I would say, shifts the focus of Bulgarian policymakers to uh, just really how to win the elections and what are the domestic topics they should focus on. And China remains completely in the periphery. And uh, until there is a stable political environment in Bulgaria, uh, and right now it is everything but stable and actually engulfed in many corruption scandals and so on. Uh, and there's also a very intensive fluctuation when it comes to uh, just uh, cadre deployments. So there's changes in all sorts of commissions, ministries all the time, and every new person that comes, of course, has to start over, and this contributes to this lack of first political will, if you say, and also just expertise, um, and also because Bulgaria, the most visible problem when it comes to foreign policy that it has, or challenge, or uh, whatever you want to call it, is actually Russia. So the whole apparatus or the whole attention is more concentrated on Russia and the challenge it poses to Bulgaria in almost every sector, be it economy or something else, or energy dependence. So oftentimes the Bulgarian political elite just doesn't want to uh, or isn't able to connect the dots when it comes to, for example, what I mentioned and me and Asya found in the paper, that there is a certain overlap between uh, between Russian, excuse me, and Chinese narratives in Bulgaria. So, just to recap, until uh, the political situation stabilizes in Bulgaria, uh, I don't think we can expect a serious approach, be it in the form of national strategy or something else, towards China. We will continue seeing uh, some like smaller scale initiatives, but I completely agree with Mareike there that here a small initiative, there a small initiative, and when you add it up, well, it's not so small anymore. So, yes.
I would probably add one layer here from the paper when it comes to Bulgaria's geopolitical hesitations, because on one hand we have the structural problems of institutional weaknesses and instability when it comes to government, but on the other hand, China somehow doesn't fit into what Bulgaria is trying to convey as messages. So for example, unlike other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, probably you would agree, Bulgaria is not willing to risk its relationship with the United States or with the EU, and to, let's say, contribute with any tension to this relationship by, let's say, coming up with a very comprehensive strategy when it comes to China. And this brings me to the bigger picture, the EU, and I'm very tempted to actually ask Mareike about, do you think that it's possible to see a big picture different, like the different strategy coming from the EU? Are we going to see EU cooperating more with China in this geopolitical climate, or moving away from China and trying to actually create more autonomous type of economical and political system?
So prior to the US elections, it was fairly clear that the European, like the European Commission was actually one of the strongest actors on better, more security focused, more European interest focused China policy. And there were a number of, measures and things that they had prepared that they were willing to go ahead with to actually make sure that Europe's interests are being defended better and that this is done in coordination with allies and partners. Now we have the problem that since the election, Donald Trump has not been very interested in working with the European Commission and in fact considers it a bit of an adversary. So that, of course, has consequences for what can happen in Brussels, because basically this coalition that stood behind better, strong, in my view, better, more security, more strategic China policy was already, of course, standing on shaky legs. That was something that was being undermined by various other member states when it came to EV tariffs. You can discuss whether we should have them or not, but when it came to them, it was passed on like a very small, not majority, but it was with and it was of course lobbied against by including countries such as Germany, right? So you have a situation where your strongest actor is already having these difficulties, and then that is being undermined not just by Russia and China, but by our biggest ally, who says we're not dealing with the European Commission, right? So that, of course, weakens the strongest actor on China on European soil. Where does that lead us? I don't know. I do hope, and I get some sense that because China is completely unwilling to take us seriously as Europe, it's really gotten worse this year, where China basically just dismisses all European concerns that are being raised, whether that is on overcapacities, whether that is on support for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. China has become even more dismissive of European interests than it was before. So in a way that does trigger a response where Europe understands we really need to stand up for our own interests and we need to become a stronger geopolitical actor. But it could go either way. It could be that it does push Europe over the edge and Europe starts to actually play its strengths. And we do have a lot going for us. We are a huge market. We do have, if we wanted to play geopolitical or economic or trade hardball, we absolutely could. And I do think we're at a point where maybe we will start doing it, but it could also tip in the other direction, where the good policies that were being developed actually end up collapsing because there is too much disunity, there is too much strife, there are too many competing interests that Europe needs to deal with at the same time, that in the end we're not gonna act on those plans. I can't tell you which way it's gonna go. It could go either way. So the preparations were quite good, and Europe was really in a place to act more assertively, more in Europe's interest vis-a-vis China. Right now, we're just squeezed and pressed from so many different directions that it's going to be really hard to say which way it's going to go.
And one question which is for both of you, and once again, if somebody from our audience wants to join, please write questions in the chat. Last question before we go to the chat. When it comes to Chinese soft power, for many years and in relation to different countries, we've been hearing the messages from China that the interest is rather economic and they don't want to intervene in politics. And so it's rather about investments and the strictly economic angle of the game. Looking at China's soft power efforts in Bulgaria, but also throughout Central and Eastern Europe, how do you see this message, and are there any strategic shifts in the recent years when it comes to the use of soft policy or soft power? Dimitar, if you want to maybe start.
Yes, thank you, Asya. Well, I think it's natural that when asked about it, China would say, no, it's largely only about the economic aspect, or prospects, but of course, we shouldn't be naive to believe that it's only about economy, and we shouldn't be naive when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party. So soft power, of course, is plays a large role, and soft power is as a tool is not only used by China, of course, but also by other countries. And as the world adapts, of course, China is also seeking to advance a soft power, and it should start somewhere. And in Bulgaria, first it started rather small, as we said back in 2006, with its the first Confucius Institute, but now it has grown, and it has very serious academic cooperation footprint in Bulgaria. So it, I think, in the future, especially in the case of Bulgaria, the soft power efforts will rather increase, and the more skepticism there is in Bulgarian society, and there's a lot of it towards politics in general, but also towards some aspects of foreign policy. So China can tap into those narratives, and as we discussed in the paper, it doesn't do overt propaganda in Bulgaria, but it just taps into this general dissatisfaction of politics in Bulgaria, and it just let's say through the radio messaging in Bulgarian that it has, it just amplifies its own narratives, criticizing Western institutions or Western Europe or the US, and uh, it it will not, and as we have discussed, it has started establishing partnerships also very proactively with Bulgarian outlets, and it will not, in my opinion, back down from this.
A couple of things maybe to add to that. One, first, I personally don't usually use the soft power framework because I find there's some flaws to that. You can use it, but overall it's not as well defined as I would like. So I'd like to usually use some other concepts to replace this. But a couple of points I want to make. First, the question that, oh, China is only economically interested. The Chinese government and the CCP openly talk about exporting China's political system. Now, how well it can do that, that's a different question, but it is now exporting the political system is now an official goal. You know, want to share China's wisdom, China's experience, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, the more countries you have around the world that they don't have to adopt China's political system, but if they respect it and they call it a legitimate alternative, that of course is hugely important for the CCP at home. And this is why I usually talk about the key actor, the party, because the party's interests ultimately also determine how China acts on the international stage. And a lot of it is geared towards ensuring regime security at home. And that is, of course, keeping the economy running. Keeping the economy running right now more than ever requires exports to Europe, especially if the US buys less, right? So that's economic security for the party, which feeds into regime security. Having a world in which China encounters as few obstacles as possible to doing what it wants, right? That also requires reshaping the world in certain ways and making sure that countries either under pressure or ideally voluntarily, but if not voluntarily, then under pressure, fall in line with what the Chinese government asks of them, right? That also makes the CCP safer at home. And then that last point, getting this ideological, is referred to as ideological security in party texts, is of course getting support, not just inside China, but also outside of China for the way that the party does things, for the political system. And this is why you will actually see a lot of resources expanded on promoting China's political system. Less so in Europe overall, but in many, many different parts of the world, there's a lot around that. You can see, when there's the 2 sessions, which is kind of the pseudo-parliament, the sessions in March, there's huge specials on that and how it, shows Chinese policy making in action, etc. So a lot of effort is expanded on promoting these systems. It often gets dismissed in Europe. I think people are likely to say, well, nobody buys into that and nobody thinks China is democratic, etc., etc. I don't know. I don't know that we necessarily have the data globally, how many people buy into this. I think we have some indications, and in any case, there is a huge push to continue pushing its own political system, its own media system, its own approach to cyber governance, including, of course, in international bodies and standard-setting bodies, etc. So even if we think it's not been very successful so far, I think it's something that we should absolutely take seriously, because it is gonna help shape the rules under which all of us live in the end.
Thank you for this reflection. Going back to the region, Central and Eastern Europe, and thinking about the differences between Bulgaria, but we also mentioned Hungary or Serbia, we see that some countries are more willing not just to cooperate, but also to challenge the European perception or the EU perception of China geopolitically. By this recognition and acceptance of the political system, but also the investments that China is eager to make in the region. I'm making this comment to just connect it to one of the questions in the chat and ask you about the strategic role of the European Commission. You mentioned need to have a united response. We have a lot, or actually the European Commission has a lot in its hands right now when it comes to coming up with strategy in relationship to the US or Russia. But what is it that the European Commission can do to actually support these countries like Bulgaria, where we don't have like a clear strategy, right? So Bulgaria doesn't speak with the voice of Hungary or Serbia in relation to China. But is there anything that the EU or the European Commission can do to help Bulgaria in these hesitations?
I mean, I can maybe start, and again, I'm going to start out that I'm not currently terribly optimistic, simply because the EU also has a lot. Basically, what Dimitar said about Bulgaria and why China is not a priority, a lot of this right now applies to a lot of countries in Europe, and in some ways also to the European Union, simply because there's so much that they're dealing with that there's a loss of focus, and you can't. Again, if you have to decide what you're going to prioritize, figuring out the Russian threat in Europe or figuring out the challenges posed by China, I understand that people choose the more immediate thing, and that's not wrong. But in terms of how to support, I mean, in many ways, the approach that the EU has on this is not terrible if done a little more stringently, is that it sets certain standards on, like encourages countries to come up with better FDI, foreign direct investment screening mechanisms, and then actually follows up and is like, hey, what are you doing on this? How are you coordinating with other EU countries, etc.? And then contacts, requires countries to have a person that's responsible and that can actually answer how the country is dealing with this. Same for, information manipulation and various other sectors. What are you doing in these sectors to make sure that you're in line with how other countries in the EU are acting around this? So in a way, a lot of this is about standard setting and enforcing standards, oftentimes without teeth. But even if you just follow up and keep countries on board, that already helps. Right now, I'm a little worried that even some of that is no longer, or is taking a second row to other concerns, right? And then in terms of, I mean, finding alternative ways of financing projects where there is feasibility, that I think we're actually not in such a bad spot. But there are, of course, that's also something to consider. But by and large, it's around making sure that countries act in similar ways on key priorities at the EU level, and that there's continued follow-up. There is, I think, also quite a bit of potential for creating better, more on-the-ground China expertise, and ensuring that there is, that, again, your China experts are not fed on knowledge that is provided directly by China. And there is an opportunity to provide funds to ensure that there is actually sufficient knowledge, that there are institutions that can help with that. And that is actually something where I think the EU could take on a stronger role to actually finance some of that a little more systematically than is happening right now. Of course, again, money is short, but this, I think, is an investment that would probably pay off. Just a couple of thoughts.
Dimitar, if you want to add something here.
Yes, thank you, Asya, and thank you, Mareike, for these points. I can really just agree with that and reiterate that, yes, one of the, as I mentioned, and as me and Asya found out during our research, is the FDI screening question. And really the EU, what it can do is support Bulgaria and help it in implementing this FDI screening. Well, for example, with technical help for risk assessment, it can, the EU also can, well, how should I put it, ensure transparency in public and EU funded projects involving non-EU actors, such as China. And yes, support media literacy and research on foreign influence, and really just promote EU and allied investment to reduce strategic dependence in strategic sectors in Bulgaria. Of course, it must also be defined what a strategic sector is, but that's a whole other discussion.
When we started working on this paper, I remember that one of the main questions we had was, okay, why Bulgaria is not actually of a strategic interest for China. And I think by the time we finished the paper, I came to the conclusion that it's not like it is not part of China's strategy and strategic efforts, but it is rather that China is also aware that Bulgaria is an EU country. So this comes with particular constraints when it comes to or limitations what a small EU country can offer in terms of economic and political cooperation. Thank you both for this. There is, I think, one question in the chat which is not entirely focused on the region, but it's more related to more the European perspective. I'll just read it. I see that Spain is growing closer to China with maybe electric vehicle plant being put there. Will the EU follow the US protectionist policies when it comes to this sector? Or lower the EV tariffs to accomplish its goal of abolishing gasoline engines. If Mareike has any reflection on this, it's slightly, as I said, it's more policy and like it's a different sector from what we've discussed.
As far as I understand, there's still several options on the table that are being considered. Overall, you can see with this approach, basically the way that China has handled the EU tariffs is it really doesn't like them. It's really putting a lot of pressure. It's sending a lot of positive messaging into various European countries about the advantages of having EVs from China. It has tried to pressure countries by giving preferential treatment for plants in their countries to those countries that oppose the tariffs or to those that stay neutral, while trying to punish the countries that were in favor of EV tariffs. So we've seen that kind of economic coercion attempt angle play out. it boils down to some of what I said before. I think there are some factors that actually promote tougher action by the EU on China, and that is the fact that China has budged very, very little when confronted with requests from European countries, from the EU and other European countries. But at the same time, it is still trying to play this divide and conquer game, and is trying to take away support from those inside the Commission who are more hawkish on China, right? The current model that the EU has is nowhere near what the United States has, right? So from an EU perspective, the EV tariffs were seen as a huge success because finally, I mean, from some perspectives, whereas from the US, I think a lot of people were wondering why so little and so late and why such a weak response. So it's been received very differently, right? So we're not exactly where the US is, but it could go either way. And I think there are some factors still pointing towards, some signs still pointing towards a more resolute response, simply also because it is about the essentials and about industry in Europe and the future of industry, but it's to be determined because the push from China in the other direction and to try to ensure that, nothing significant is going to happen or existing policy is going to get watered down is quite strong.
Thank you for this. Maybe just a last question to wrap up our discussion. If there are more questions in the chat, I'm happy to bring them to our speakers. But when it comes to Bulgaria's, how to say, attempts to cooperate with China without having comprehensive strategy, Dimitar, do you believe that there is an opportunity for Bulgaria to develop its own model of engagement with China, or we will see something rather similar to Hungary, to Serbia, or like a shifting away from these examples, given that Bulgaria wants to cooperate, if we see like at the local level, municipal level, as you mentioned, but at the national or governmental level, this is less visible. So in this sense, is it a unique model, or is it something that we also observe in the region, in other countries in the region?
Thank you, Asya. This is actually a very interesting and relevant question to think about whether Bulgaria can develop some sort of its own unique approach. In a way, I strongly believe that if Bulgaria or the Bulgarian decision makers, if they embark on this journey, they could develop a unique approach or response to China. But unfortunately, as I said before, and this might be just me, but I'm highly skeptical that this is going to happen, or that this is going to happen in the immediate future. However, I don't think Bulgaria could be in, or find itself in the same situation as Hungary or Serbia, because as we know, Hungary and Serbia are very close to Russia and then by extent to China, and this is not the situation in Bulgaria. So I think, be it for lack of political will or just because the priorities lay elsewhere in Bulgaria right now, and that's domestic challenges and problems, Bulgaria will just most probably, in my opinion, be in this gray area where it kind of, instead of having a unified approach, it just decides case by case. And I'll be happy to see a unified approach, don't get me wrong, but I just don't think it's going to happen. So,
which I guess makes it difficult to answer another question in the chat about the divide between public and private partners when it comes to Chinese projects in Bulgaria. I would say that this was a challenge for both of us with Dimitar when we were working on the paper, because the information is rather limited. And when it comes to especially private investments, at some point the trace is lost. You see this information, this bombastic piece of news about another huge Chinese investment in like a rural area of Bulgaria, and then suddenly there is no further information, there is no follow-up. So in this sense, I would say that there is no like strict division between public and private. When it comes to Chinese cooperation, they definitely need the local level bridge or links that would lead them to the possibilities to invest at a local level. But on the other hand, it is also very unsystematic and not strategic from the point of view of like whether engagements are more with the government or at the municipal level. My impression is that it was rather like from the data that we gathered is that the focus of Chinese efforts is rather local and municipal level than governmental one. Mareike, final comments and maybe thoughts on this from you.
I also don't know for the last question. I don't know how the division is, and I think one, because I haven't looked into the Bulgarian case in detail, but also I think what you highlighted is quite true, and it's quite emblematic that you have a bombastic announcement and then it fizzles out and you don't know if it actually, you have to kind of try to follow up if it actually went through or not. That's actually quite common, or you have just some kind of commitment, which is why, for the longest time when Chinese investments overseas and along the BRI or elsewhere were valued incredibly high and are probably lower simply because a lot of announcements were counted into it. But I don't, about the concrete question, I don't know what the exact division is, whether there's a focus on private companies in Bulgaria or public. You're muted. You're still muted, I think.
Just additional question to this though, doesn't this affect China's image? If we have these consistent disappointments after investments that never continue and never turn into something that's actually tangible and good for a specific country in Central and Eastern Europe, isn't it something that China has to reconsider in terms of maintaining public image in the region?
I think there's two ways of dealing with this, and this is something that China deals with in many different regions. One is suppress negative press, which is something, you do it at home. If you can do it abroad, that's great. Where you can't do it, less great, but you can always try to minimize negative press or try to discredit critics, which I think is one approach. So I think, and then you do have some adjustments to policy. So for instance, for the Belt and Road Initiative, China has switched from the large investments to what it calls Xiao'ermei, small and beautiful. So you have more investments in strategic, smaller projects that actually serve Chinese interests more and less throwing out money there into big infrastructure projects, etc. So there is some rethinking and some rebranding around this. But yeah, it's much more likely that China is going to try to rebrand it and suppress criticism than necessarily pony up more money where it's not in China's interest.
Thank you both for this very insightful discussion. I learned a lot in addition to what we've done already with Dimitar in the paper. Once again, our audience can find the link to the full report in the chat. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. There will be a recording of today's discussion that you can find later on the YouTube channel of the GMF. It was my pleasure to moderate it, and I wish everybody a good rest of the day.